Coming up next on BBC One will be nothing.
Hey there, folks. This is gonna be one of those odd topics that I didn't think I was gonna have anything to say about, but somebody asked actually in the premiere chat for the last video that went up if I was gonna talk about this at all. And at the time I said, yeah, I don't think so. But then I started thinking about it, and then I started looking into it, and then I'm like, yeah, maybe. And that's what's going on at the BBC with its funding, or rather the cutting off of its current funding model, if that actually goes through. Now, part of me wanted to be like, that's not really my wheelhouse to talk about, except it kind of is. I've talked about big moves and shakeups at companies like Warner Brothers when they gutted DC or when Disney acquired Fox. So I've talked about these kinds of things before when it comes to entities, particularly ones that are related in some way to things I otherwise talk about. And well, I talk about Doctor Who a lot. Now, I'm not really going to be filtering this through a discussion of Doctor Who in specific. I'm going to be talking about the topic in the broad terms. Part of the reason I was nervous to talk about this, and this is also sort of my caveat up front to try and give myself a little bit of wiggle room, I don't inherently know as much about the BBC and its funding model as I do about, say, corporate entities like Disney or Warner Brothers. To put it simply, living and working in America and having worked at various levels and interacted with all levels of a corporate structure in the US has given me way more knowledge of how these things work and how these entities tend to think than I would honestly like to have. But the BBC, while it is a corporation, technically, it is publicly funded. So my normal understanding of the keep pushing profit at all costs, maximize income in whatever way can do it, doesn't really apply here because the way they get their funding was fixed, and it wasn't something that they actually could adjust to bring in more money. So it's a bit of a different beast. And since I'm not myself from the UK, I have had to look a lot of this stuff up, and there might be holes in my research, or there might just be background things that aren't even in the kind of things I research that you would just know for living there that I don't. So I honestly feel like this is probably going to be more helpful to people in my situation who don't live in the UK. I have a strong feeling I'm going to get more than a few comments from my UK viewers, because I know there's a decent number of you, on things I missed or got wrong or what have you. I'm still going to do my best. I'm not using that as an excuse to be lazy about this. I'm going to try and cover this topic as best and as thoroughly as I'm able to. Just understand I'm working with a handicap on this one, more so than is normally the case on any time I talk about something that isn't a standard topic for me. So that out of the way, what is going on with the BBC? Well, they're kind of screwed, or at least it's looking that way right now. So the short version is that Nadine Dorries, who is the culture secretary in the UK, has done two things. One, she has announced a freeze on the BBC licensing fee. If you don't know what that is, don't worry, I'll get to it. But she's announced a freeze on it so that it will not increase over the next 2 years. Now, that might just sound like, okay, so they're not going to raise the cost to the general public for what they use to fund the BBC. What's the problem with that? Well, with the current state of inflation and where that's expected to go, that's basically looking at effectively a $2 billion budget cut to the BBC. But more importantly, she has said that they plan to end that funding scheme at the end of the current Royal Charter. The Royal Charter being the current stretch of time under which things are supposed to operate as they currently are, and after which they can then be changed into a different model or theoretically dropped completely. Now that ends on the last day of 2027. So right now there is a ticking clock that after which the BBC may not exist anymore, or at least not in the form it currently is in and has been in for a very, very long time. Now, again, for folks who aren't from the UK, I should explain the licensing fee. As I said, the BBC is publicly funded. Now, the closest thing we have in the US is something like the National Endowment of the Arts or the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, but that's a little bit different and kind of weird around here because that funds certain national efforts to have these things like public radio and PBS, the TV channel, running, but the individual local channels have to do their own regional funding. It's why you always see the pledge drives or hear them on the radio for those sorts of things. Local stations are kind of on their own for most of their funding. And the National Endowment for the Arts in the U.S. is something that has been a bit of a political football for, well, longer than I've been alive, actually. It's still in place, but it ain't much. The way the BBC does it, the licensing fee is basically, well, you have to have a license to get TV broadcast from the BBC, is how that works. So what that means is, while they can't actually prevent you from receiving BBC television signals, whether it was back in the day where you could pick it up on just on the local broadcast, or whether it be now with it coming as standard channels, but if you're getting that in your home, you are supposed to be paying a licensing fee to be able to have that. Now, this started back in 1946, post-war. And initially, adjusted for inflation, was significantly cheaper, but that's because when the funding for that started, it was for one channel in black and white. In the 60s, they introduced separate fees for getting black and white signal or getting color signal, basically whether you had a color or a black and white television set, with the color being more expensive. Now, once they implemented that, the raw number for what it cost has been going up steadily. However, adjusted for inflation, it's kind of been up and down and all over the place. The fee has not always kept pace with inflation, which is now what's going to happen because it's going to be frozen for the next 2 years, despite inflation going to be increasing by all indications. Now, the licensing fees was kind of a roundabout way to do it because it wasn't really a direct tax, because when it was implemented, not everybody had a TV. So having literally everybody pay this tax didn't make sense. So instead, paying it if you had a TV and were getting those signals, that was who was going to pay it. So in many ways, at least the initiation of the licensing fee program is an outdated model, or at least it certainly started from a completely different mentality than they have now. And there's some odd quirks in the history of it. Like, for a long time, the BBC claimed to have what they called TV detector vans, which could detect whether or not a signal was being received into a house that had not paid its licensing fee, and they would then fine you. There's every indication that such a thing never existed and was just a propaganda thing to scare people into paying their licensing fees. Now, licensing fee payments in general have been going down, and most of that is chalked up to people switching to streaming things like Netflix and other services of that nature. There's also possibly an increase in just basically protests not willing to pay it. You can get fined for that, but I'm going to kind of come back to that. So the angle to change or defund or alter the way the funding is done for the BBC, or possibly get rid of the licensing fee altogether, has generally been a push from the conservative side of UK politics. Now, I'm going to try to the best of my ability not to get overly political, or at least not be overly expressive of my own political opinions in this. Some of it's going to leak through. I can't help that. But that's the simple truth. The conservative side have been the ones pushing for this. Boris Johnson had floated, I think a couple of years ago, the possibility of making the licensing fee voluntary, which seemed very much at the time, that never happened, by the way, but that seemed very much at the time to be something to basically slowly strangle the BBC to death. Because, you know, people, if they didn't have to pay it, why would they? Like some people would, but not enough to fund the dang thing. Whereas now, Nadine Dorries' move just seems to be, no, we're not gonna do this slow death. We're just gonna kill it at the first available date, which is the end of the charter. Now, I kind of have to focus on Nadine Dorries in specific because she's said more than a few things over the last few years that make her angle on this pretty clear. Now, a lot of this is stuff from Twitter and tweets from even a number of years ago. Probably the most telling one was a tweet where she said that left-wing snowflakes were killing comedy. Now, while some of these tweets, like I said, date from a couple years ago, she's never walked back any of this. And about the closest she's come is she's tried to like muddy the waters a little bit in terms of how harsh and direct and like very clear that she was basically just complaining about anything that didn't align with the conservative values that she held. She was finding a way to complain about. She's tried to, in interviews, make it a little bit murkier that wasn't quite what she was doing.
Left-wing snowflakes and their woke agenda is quite aggressive.
Well, there are some people who will politicise that, and that's what I'm talking about when I do that.
And in fact, I want to talk about her recent tweet where she kind of announced this entire plan. The days of the elderly being threatened with prison sentences and bailiffs knocking on doors are over. Now, first thing there, that's... did that happen? Yeah, kind of, not much. I looked up into the statistics as best as I could find, because actually a lot of the law enforcement and government entities don't keep proper track of what happens in terms of warrants issued or arrests or fees or fines related to failure to pay TV licensing fees. There's some data out there, and generally what the data points to is it doesn't happen that much. Not a lot of warrants are requested to investigate this, and only about half of those are granted, and not even all of those are actually carried out. And it also varies by region. Scotland basically doesn't do this at all. Most of it seems to happen in England and second most in Wales. But a lot of other parts of the UK don't really seem to have that level of enforcement at all. So basically what Nadine Dorries is doing there is she's taking the most outlier, extreme cases of what can happen under the current system and presenting it as if it's something that's happening all the time. It's a very common technique. All sides of any political debate use this a lot. So it's a very common technique, but it's also inherently, by its nature, deceptive. And as far as threats of prison, sort of, but not exactly. So far as I was able to find, people don't actually get jail time or get threatened with jail time for not paying their licensing fees. What they get threatened with jail time for is failing to pay the fine for not paying their licensing fees. So it's like a couple steps down the line. It's not like, hey, you didn't pay your TV license fee, go to jail. It's, hey, you didn't pay your TV license fee, here's the fine for that. Well, I'm not going to pay this. We're going to take you to court now. Will you pay the fine? No, I won't pay the fine. Okay, now we're going to put you in jail. And that has happened, again, very little, with an average jail sentence of about 9 days from the last year that I could find any kind of data on that, which was 2018. So it wouldn't be fair to say that she is making that up and that doesn't happen at all, because technically it does. But first of all, the association of having it happen to elderly people is very specifically targeted because conservative politics generally appeal more to the elderly. So yeah, that's pretty obvious. But then there's the other half of this, which I think is even more telling, which is where she says, time to discuss and debate new ways of funding. Now, what's funny to me about this is she has set an end date for when the current funding model for the BBC is going to end. And she says now it's time to discuss and debate a new funding model, meaning she doesn't have one. She's not coming in and saying, we've got a plan for how to do this better. And once we have all solidified what that is, we're going to change it. No, she's saying, no, we end it now, and we'll talk about what to do after that. It reminds me a great deal of what the Republicans tried to do with Obamacare under Trump. They were very fixated on dismantling it as much as they possibly could, but at every step of the way, they didn't have a plan to replace it. And they didn't really completely upend it. They did weaken it substantially from what it was, but they never really had a replacement plan. But they kept trying to end it anyways. Very clearly the priority not being, we're going to stop this because we have a better idea, but we're going to stop this because we hate it. Maybe we'll come up with a better idea if we can be bothered. So it is funny that it kind of rhymed with that, at least to my eye. Now, assuming this happens and does go through, what happens to the BBC? Well, most likely they will look into alternate funding methods. I think it's unlikely that there will simply cease to be a BBC. That's not 100% impossible, but I find that to be the least likely. But it's definitely going to have to change from the ground up. Possible alternate funding models would include things like advertising. Part of the benefit of the BBC being funded by the license fees means that there is no advertising for anything other than like what's on later tonight on the BBC. They don't have corporate sponsors and advertisements run on it. Now, they could start doing that. The problem there is, again, streaming has really eaten into the value of advertising. And basically, unless you're buying a Super Bowl ad spot, these companies aren't paying as much to run ads as they used to. They're just not, because TV doesn't have the stranglehold on the audience that it did before the days of streaming. So while they could do that, it would still probably be looking at significant cuts to their budget in order to do that. There is the possibility of setting up some kind of Netflix-style service where people will basically not have access to the BBC at all unless they pay a subscription for it. Now, that differs from the licensing fee because anyone who has a TV set up can get the BBC. They're supposed to have paid their license in order to do that, but like they can technically get their hands on it. Doing it as a subscription model, you could actually fully prevent anyone who hasn't paid for the subscription from to the extent that you can with Netflix. People share their passwords, it happens, but that's another option. The problem is it's really unclear how high the demand's going to be for something like that. It's also going to make the BBC far more susceptible to having to bow to the whims of what appeals to the audience. Now, that might sound like a duh. Why shouldn't they appeal to the audience? But one can make the argument, at least, especially from an artistic and a news integrity angle, it's to the general benefit that the BBC does not have to appeal to audiences because it's funded whether people like what's on it or not. Now, again, if you don't like what's on it, that can be incredibly frustrating. I do not doubt that. But broadly speaking, that enables it to do things that it feels have artistic merit in terms of its dramatic and entertainment programming, or that it feels are vitally important in terms of its news programming without having to worry about what the ratings are. Now, that's not to say the BBC doesn't keep track of the ratings. They are. But they don't solely dictate things the way they do when you have to keep your audience happy, or they'll leave and won't pay the subscription fee, and suddenly you're not making anywhere near as much money. The instant that it depends on a subscription model is the instant that they have to alter everything they do, and the entire mentality of the BBC has to go from, we think this is something worth doing, we think this is artistically valid and worth producing, to, will people like it? And that's not to say will people like it is not some kind of factor, but it doesn't have to be the driving factor. It would have to become the driving factor in that kind of model, which again would represent a fundamental shift in what the BBC is and how it does anything that it does. And then there's the third option, which is direct funding from the government as a budget item. Now, that might not sound particularly different from the licensing fee, because isn't that still publicly funded? Yes, but it makes the politics a lot more fraught. Here's what I mean by that. Because the BBC itself is empowered to collect the fees and enforcement to the best of its ability, that means that while the nature of the fees, the cost of the fees, whether they're allowed to go up, that is to some degree controlled by the government, but the actual collection of the fees is done by the BBC. And if everyone is paying their TV license that is supposed to be, then once the BBC has that, that's just their budget that they figure out what to do with. If they start getting funded directly by the government, then that means that whoever's in control of the government can increase, decrease, or threaten to do either one in a way that will very substantively affect the programming. Basically, because the government would have direct control of the purse that the BBC would be funded from, it gives them more direct power to swing the political perspectives of the BBC as a whole and BBC News in specific. Now, that is kind of flatly what some of them probably want. I'm not necessarily going to say Nadine Dorries specifically wants that, but if she is complaining about a quote-unquote left-wing bias in BBC programming and not even limiting those complaints to the news since she was complaining about comedy, then yeah, that is the kind of mentality that you could see leading to someone who, if they had control of the funding, just going, stop making stuff with this perspective, or we'll cut your budget. Now, to a certain extent, there is still already political control over the BBC, but it's not direct. It is still a stage removed because of the way the licensing fee works. But it is still there. Like, I would not be shocked if a lot of the stuff that Tim Davie, who is the current person running the BBC, if a lot of the stuff he's been doing and saying, particularly around BBC News, is not partially in the hope of heading off this move. Because a little while back, folks will remember my issues with the news arm of the BBC right now. There's a link to the original video that I did talking about my issues with a particular article, which they have continued to fail to acknowledge the problems with it of all time, not just the transphobia, also the outright provable lies. If you want more information beyond that, I'll put some links down in the description to not only my video, but the now 3 videos that Sean has done on the topic, as well as a terrific speech from Laura K. Dale, who was part of a protest outside the BBC offices. But in the wake of that, one of the things Tim Davie has now said in various very questionable forms was to push the idea of the BBC being as objective and as neutral as possible, even going so far as to say if enough members of the public expressed interest, he would give airtime to flat earth advocates, which is absurd. The job of the news is to present the truth, not to present all sides of an argument when one side of that argument has no merit. But he has been saying that stuff, and the fact that he's been saying that has been bizarre and like almost memed in some cases. But it makes a lot more sense now that we've seen Nadine Dorries make her move. And I would not be shocked to learn that Tim Davie did that and said those things in the hope of trying to quell this move from someone like Nadine Dorries, knowing that this kind of thing was coming or being discussed. If he was trying to push as loudly and publicly as he could, we don't have a bias, we are neutral. Look how neutral we are. We'll even let flat earthers come on. That's how neutral we are. Don't cut us for being left wing. But she's doing it anyways. Or at least she's planning to. And that's the last thing. We're looking at more than 5 years down the line for this to fully take effect. So if there is a change in which party is currently in control of the government, that's 5 years in which this course can be altered and changed and walked back and undone. So that's also a possibility. But you can expect that until such time as that happens, at the very least, those discussions about how do we fund this then are still going to have to happen. Now, there's too much invested in the BBC, not just financially, but culturally. I think for them to just let it die. I don't think this is a case of the Tories actually want, that's the Conservative Party in the UK. I don't think they actually want the service completely dead. They just want it to say what they want to hear. And I think the cultural and even political impact of just letting the entire thing die, I don't think that would be good for them. And I think they know that. At least that's sort of my outsider view. I could be wrong about that. I'm going by the vibe I get and what makes sense to me, but I'm not on the ground in the UK, so what do I know? As for the impact on certain things in particular, like, say, Doctor Who, I would actually say Doctor Who is one of the things that is least likely to be completely cut. Depending on what happens, I mean, initially with the several $billion lost just from inflation and them not being allowed to raise the fee, Doctor Who may be reduced in episodes yet again. That's a possibility. But Doctor Who is one of the bigger properties for the BBC because it gets licensed and appears on services outside the UK. It's on HBO Max, and there was a deal cut that HBO Max paid to be able to do that. So, like, the big things that are well-known and well-marketed outside the UK, like Doctor Who or even something like the Great British Bake Off, those are the things that are going to stay because not only, regardless of their specific level of popularity in the UK itself, they will bring in significant money from partnerships outside of the UK. So because of that, they're kind of too big to drop, at least as it currently stands. It's one of the reasons why the things about the Doctor Who ratings and why I haven't indulged that conversation in a long time is that the ratings at this point are not even secondary, they're tertiary. Because a lot of the revenue generated by something like Doctor Who isn't even directly from the show itself anymore. It's from licensing it out. And the value of being able to do that is higher if there is going to continue to be more new content than if it's a dead thing that you're just basically licensing out a library of back episodes. So for that reason, I have not indulged the ratings talk in a long time, despite being well aware ratings for the Chibnall era have not been good, especially towards the end of it. But there's also been an overall decline on views for BBC as a whole. Again, streaming is a big part of that. So there's certainly an argument to be made that maybe it was time for the BBC to evolve and to change just because of how old its funding model was. Does it even make sense anymore? But it's still really troubling to me that the plan seems to be, well, let's definitely kill its current state right now. We'll figure out how to change it later. Anytime something gets approached that way, especially by politicians, that's going to get an eyebrow raise and a from me. But again, outsider looking in, not my country. But that is the state of the BBC, what things look like now and where they may or may not be going in the future, to the best of my ability to explain and even understand, not being someone actually down in the thick of it. What are your thoughts on all of this? Any of it? How much did I get wrong? Whatever your thoughts are, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. I have a Patreon if you wish to support what I do and keep this whole operation up and running. The likes, the shares, and subscribes, they help me out as well. There's also links to my other stuff, Twitch, TikTok, Twitter, all of that. But don't worry too much about it. Because what I really want you to remember is that you are beautiful, you are valid, and you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. Thanks for sticking around into the credits. None of this would have been possible without my Patreon supporters in particular. I want to thank Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Vincent Paul Bartolucci, Robin Moore, Shayla Gourlay, and Bookworm. Thanks for keeping this going. And to everybody,